The wind didn't whisper that night. It roared down from the Rockies like a debt collector with a grudge, slamming against the cabin walls till the timbers groaned. October had come mean and early, freezing the mud in the ruts of Harrow Creek Road and turning every breath into a ghost that hung in the dark. Inside, by the last red eye of a dying fire, a woman sat alone, broad-shouldered, solid as the mountains themselves. Her calloused hands held one sheet of paper so tight the edges bit into her skin. $430. December 15th, 7 weeks. She didn't weep. She didn't pray. She only stared into the coals like a woman reading her own sentence. Outside, the wind dropped sudden, dead quiet. Then came the sound, slow, deliberate hoofbeats crunching through the frost. 3 measured knocks on the door. Not begging, not demanding, just the knock of a man who already knew what he was coming for. The woman lifted her head. The firelight carved hard shadows across her face. In that frozen instant, the whole high country held its breath. Something was about to break, or be born. And whatever walked through that door next would decide which. The cold came early that October. Not the kind that eases in slowly, that gives you a week of warning and lets you prepare. This cold rolled down from the Rockies like it had somewhere to be, like it had papers on the land below and was coming to collect. It arrived overnight, and by morning the puddles along the main road of Harrow Creek had gone hard, and the breath of horses hung in the air like small, departing ghosts. Willa Fenn Briggs felt it before she opened her eyes. She felt it in the blanket that had been thin for 3 winters now and showed no signs of improving. She felt it in the gap under the cabin door where the wood had warped 2 summers ago and nobody had fixed it because fixing things required time, and time was the one resource this family had never managed to accumulate. She felt it in her own breath rising above her face in the gray pre-dawn dark like something trying to leave. She counted to 3. She always gave herself exactly 3 seconds in the morning before getting up. It was the only indulgence she allowed herself, and she had never once extended it to 4. Then she got up, because there was no other choice. There never was. Not since she was 16 and her mother went fast with a fever that a doctor might have caught sooner if they'd had money for a doctor. Not since her father came up from the mine that last time with dust in his lungs that the years had calcified into something permanent and slow. Not since the night she sat alone with a candle and a borrowed pencil and worked out the numbers, and the numbers said what they always said, not enough. She pulled on her work dress in the dark, laced her boots without looking at them, put her hair in its braid, the same braid every morning because there was no time for anything prettier, and went to start the fire. Her father's breathing came through the thin wall between the main room and his corner. That sound. She had learned to hear it the way some people learn to read weather, the texture of it, the depth, the spaces between. On good mornings it was rough but steady. On bad mornings it came in ragged pulls like something tearing slowly. This was a middling morning, rough but steady. She built the fire from last night's coals and put the water on and stood for a moment in the growing warmth, looking at the tin box on the shelf beside her father's chair. The letter from the Denver bank was in that box. She didn't need to open it. She had it memorized down to the punctuation. $430. December 15th, 7 weeks from today. She knew that number the way she knew her own heartbeat. It was there when she woke, and there when she lay down, and there in the spaces between every other thought, a steady, patient, completely merciless fact. Harrow Creek, Colorado had given Willa Fenn Briggs a number of things over the course of her 24 years. The ability to stretch a dollar until it apologized. The habit of watching faces rather than listening to mouths because faces were harder to curate. A sensitivity finely tuned, almost involuntary, to the specific texture of obligated kindness, which was the kind she received most often. And the knowledge acquired gradually and then all at once that the world had a category for women like her and had placed her firmly in it and was not particularly interested in reclassification. She was not small. She had never been small. She was broad-shouldered and solid-built the way women are built when they've done hard physical work their entire lives, which she had. She was strong in a way that was obvious to anyone who watched her work and invisible to anyone who looked at her and saw only the size of her, which was most people. They saw the dress let out at the seams, the practical braid, the work boots and the capable hands and the weight of her, and they filed her away. In the category of women who would manage, who would survive, who were perhaps admirable in their way, but who were not in the particular vocabulary of Harrow Creek, Colorado in the year 1885, the kind of woman that things happened to. Willa had known this for a long time. She had stopped arguing with it internally or otherwise because argument cost energy she didn't have to spare. She noted it, moved past it, got on with things. She got on with things now, put the porridge on, counted what was left of the cornmeal, did the mental arithmetic of the week's provisions against the week's needs, the way she did every morning, and came to the same conclusion she always came to. It would be enough barely if she was careful. She was always careful. Careful was the only way she knew how to be. Tuesday morning. The trading post smelled the way it always smelled: old tobacco, older credit, and the particular staleness of a building where people came to exchange money they didn't have for things they couldn't quite do without. She needed cornmeal, salt, and lamp oil. She had coin enough for 2 of the 3 and made the calculation on the walk over. Cornmeal and lamp oil. Salt they could manage without for a few days. The other 2 they could not. The sack of cornmeal was heavier than expected. 40 pounds at least, packed tight the way Horace always packed things, as though he'd taken a personal offense to the existence of airspace inside a sack. She was working it toward the door when someone stepped into her peripheral vision. Young. One of the Garrett boys, Tom or James, she could never keep them sorted. "You need a hand with that." She didn't look up. "No? You sure that looks—" I said no. He stepped back. She felt the relief come off him like heat off summer stone. He had offered because the social obligation required it, not because he wanted to. There was a specific texture to that kind of help, a hovering, a held breath, a hope that you'd say no and release them. Willa had spent her whole life learning to feel that texture, had developed a sensitivity to it, the way some people developed a sensitivity to change in barometric pressure. She got the sack to the door, set it against the frame, breathed once, then picked it up and carried it the rest of the way to the wagon without stopping. Behind her something was said, low, then a short laugh. She didn't turn, didn't need to. She loaded the sack, climbed up, and drove home through the cold morning. Walt Briggs was sitting up when she got back. That was a good sign. Some mornings he couldn't manage it. He was 58 years old and looked considerably older. 20 years in the mines had done things to his lungs that time and fresh air could not undo. He breathed like something slowly crumpling. On bad nights, the sound came through the cabin walls, and Willa would lie in her corner counting his inhales, measuring the space between them, making sure the spaces didn't grow too long. His eyes were still sharp. That was the cruelest part, in a way his mind completely intact, understanding his situation with perfect clarity, unable to protect himself from that understanding. He watched her unload from the doorway. "The bank letter came again," he said. "I know." "Willa." "I know, Papa." She carried the cornmeal inside and set it against the wall and started the fire from last night's coals. The letter sat in its tin box by his chair. She didn't open it. Every word was already in her. $430. December 15th, 7 weeks. Denny appeared from the back room. He was 9 years old and had his grandfather's eyes, sharp and dark and seeing everything. His hair was wild and one boot was unlaced as always. "Is there porridge?" "There will be." "Can I have extra?" "There isn't extra." He absorbed this without complaint. 9 years old and already fluent in the language of not enough. "Mama Sutton says Papa's cough was worse yesterday," he said, reporting, not lamenting, the tone of a child who has lived with something long enough to stop being frightened by it and started being matter-of-fact. "I know. She says he needs the medicine from Denny." She turned from the fire and looked at him, gentle but final. The look that meant, "I know, and I have no solution to give you, so please stop opening the door to the room where I keep that fact. Go find your sister. Breakfast in 20 minutes. He went. She put on the water. That evening, Walt tried to apologize. He did this more and more as the weeks went by, as if the diminishing of his body was making room for all the guilt he'd stored up, and it was filling the space and needing somewhere to go. He sat by the fire with the bank letter, turning it over and over. "I've been thinking," he said, "about Harlan Dodd. No. He has land, he's steady, he's 47 and he smells like the south end of his mule Papa. No." Walt was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines and found the cabin's gaps and came through them, all of them, because there were many, and the fire leaned. "There aren't many roads left," he said. Not cruelly, just honestly, the way very sick people are honest because they've run out of time for the alternatives. "I know," Willa said. She kept mending the shirt in her lap. This was the 3rd time she'd mended it. The fabric at the elbows was nearly translucent. Soon there would be nothing left to stitch the patches to. She knew. She had always known. The arithmetic of their lives had never been complicated. There just wasn't enough, had never been enough, and the options were narrowing the way a canyon narrows gradually, and then all at once until there was one path and the walls on either side were too steep to climb. What she did not know was that the last option had already saddled his horse, was already on the road, would arrive at her door in the dark before the week was out. Clara was 11 years old and conducted her life as though the natural world was a continuous and endlessly interesting scientific exhibition mounted specifically for her benefit. She talked to everything: beetles, fence posts, the creek in spring when it ran high, the clouds when they moved in formations she found particularly noteworthy. Willa had found this unsettling when Clara was smaller and had gradually arrived at a kind of peace with it. At least someone in this household was having a pleasant conversation. Clara had their mother's eyes dark and careful, seeing things other people walked past. She noticed which neighbor's fence had leaned a little more this month. She noticed when the baker put less salt in the bread. She noticed and had mentioned once very quietly that Willa's shoulders had been riding higher this past week than they usually did, and had Willa been sleeping. Willa had said she was fine. Clara had looked at her for one long beat and had not disagreed, but had also clearly not entirely believed her. This was the thing about Clara. She was 11 years old, and she had the specific perceptiveness of someone who had learned early that what people said and what was true were sometimes different things. That morning, Willa found her crouched behind the cabin face 6 inches from a flat rock, watching a beetle make its deliberate way across the surface. "Breakfast," Willa said. "In a minute, Clara. She's doing something important." Clara didn't look up. "She has eggs. She's finding somewhere warm before the real cold comes." Willa stood there a moment, watched the beetle, small and certain, moving without hesitation across the rock toward wherever she'd decided she needed to be. No looking back, no second-guessing the direction, just moving. Must be like that, Willa thought, to be so clear on what you needed that the moving happened on its own. "Inside," she said. "It's cold." Clara came, but she looked back once at the beetle on her way up the cabin steps, the particular look of someone who is going to finish thinking about something later when there is time. Willa understood that look completely. She heard the horse just before 9 that night. Not the sound of someone passing through that had a particular quality, a continuous rhythm that faded. This was something slowing, stopping, deliberate, like a person who knew exactly where they were going and had been certain of it for some time. She set down the shirt she was mending. Walt reached for the rifle over the door. Old habit. The rifle was as old as Denny and worked technically, but was better understood as a statement of position than an actual threat. 3 knocks. Not timid, not demanding. Measured. The knock of someone who had a reason to be there and was prepared to explain it calmly. Willa got to the door first. She opened it. The man on the porch was tall, broad in the way of someone who'd done outdoor physical work for a long time. Not size for its own sake, but the accumulated result of use. He wore a leather coat that had seen hard years, canvas trousers and boots so caked in road mud she couldn't read them. A dark beard, thick and ungroomed. Eyes the pale gray of winter sky in the hour before snow falls. Not young, not old. Somewhere in his early to mid-30s, though the mountains had a way of aging faces that made precision unreliable. He took off his hat when she opened the door. Held it in both hands, the brim turning slowly. Not from nerves, she could tell the difference, but from a deliberate respect so habitual it had become reflex. "Miss Briggs," he said, not a question, he already knew. "Who's asking?" "Jasper Holt." A pause. He was choosing his words the way you'd choose a tool for function rather than appearance. "I have land up in the high range. I heard your family has had some difficulty." "Heard from who?" "Trading post, people talk." "They do," she agreed. "Mostly about things that aren't their business." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, more like the recognition that a point had been made correctly. "I don't usually listen," he said. "I listened this time." Walt appeared behind her rifle present, but not raised the correct posture, announcing itself without making demands. "What do you want?" Willa said. Direct. She had found that directness was the most efficient use of everyone's time. He looked at her. Not around her, not past her at Walt or at the interior of the cabin, at her. Directly. Without flinching and without that flicker of recalibration she had learned to expect, that fractional adjustment people made when they looked at her and had to reorganize something internal before they could continue. This man didn't reorganize anything. He just looked. "I need a wife," he said. "And I believe you need a solution to a very specific kind of trouble." He came inside because Walt stepped back and made room. He sat in the chair by the fire like a man who knew how to take up the right amount of space. Not too much. Not an apology for himself, just exactly what the situation required. He kept his hat in his hands and spoke plainly. He had land in the high range, ran cattle in summer, spent winters maintaining the property and preparing for the following year. He was 34. He had been married once before. He said this plainly without fishing for sympathy or making it bigger than it was, and his wife had died of fever 2 winters past. He needed someone practical, someone who understood cold mornings and hard work, and the particular quality of silence that comes from living far from neighbors. In exchange for coming to him as his wife, he would settle the debt with the Denver bank, the full amount before December 15th. He would also send food and firewood enough to keep the cabin and the family through the winter and into spring. He laid it out like a man presenting facts, not making a pitch. Which was, Willa supposed, what it was: the facts of what he needed and the facts of what he was prepared to provide. The fire crackled. From the corner of her eye she could see Denny's face at the top of the ladder to the sleeping loft, chin in hands, watching with the absolute attention of a child who has been told specifically not to eavesdrop and has interpreted this instruction loosely. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." What is enough? He considered it. Actually considered it the way a person considers something when the answer matters to them and they're not willing to give a careless one. "I was at the county fair in July," he said. "Your sister Clara, she was almost knocked down by a man coming out of the beer tent. He was moving fast, not watching. You stepped in front of her." He looked at the hat in his hands. "You didn't calculate it. You didn't think about how it looked. You just moved." Willa said nothing. "He was considerably larger than you," Jasper said. "Most people are considerably larger than an 11-year-old girl," she said. "That's not what's remarkable." "No," he said quietly. "What was remarkable was that you didn't look frightened afterward. You looked irritated, like someone had jostled your elbow on a crowded street." She held his gaze for a moment. "So you know that I don't move out of the way," she said. "I know that you move toward what needs doing without stopping to calculate whether it's convenient." A pause. "That's what I need. Not someone who'll follow instructions, someone who'll stand." The fire settled with a soft collapse of wood. Walt's breathing was audible in the room's quiet, that familiar rough texture of it. "I'll think on it," she said. He nodded, stood, put on his hat. 2 days, he said. "I'll come back in 2 days. Take the time. Think clearly. Don't let fear make the decision yours or anyone else's." Then he walked out into the dark, got on his horse and was gone up the road before Willa had finished processing the last quarter hour of her life. Walt looked at her. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't—" "You were about to say something hopeful. I can see it on your face. Give me 2 days, like the man said." She sat back down with her mending. Her hands didn't tremble. She'd made sure of that before she picked it up. She didn't sleep much. She lay in her corner listening to the wind at the roof and Walt's breathing through the wall and the occasional creak of settling logs, and she thought. She was good at thinking. It was what she did instead of hoping, instead of the softer things that cost more than she could afford. She ran the facts the way she ran a column of numbers, straight through, no sentiment. She knew almost nothing about this man. He had a horse and a worn coat and pale gray eyes that looked at her directly, and a story about the county fair that she couldn't decide was touching or deeply unsettling. He had watched her without introducing himself, had learned about her family, had made a plan. That was something to think about carefully. And yet, the letter in the tin box. December 15th, 7 weeks. $430 that didn't exist and couldn't be made to exist in time by any honest means available to her. Her father's breathing through the wall, that sound. Denny and Clara, who didn't understand the full shape of what was coming, who were still young enough to believe things worked out, who deserved to stay that young for as long as possible. She was not going to find $430 at Horace's trading post. She was not going to marry Harlan Dodd. She was not going to let the bank take the cabin and the claim and watch her family split apart in the middle of a Colorado winter. So, she lay in the dark and was honest with herself the way she'd learned to be completely without the comfort of exception. She was going to say yes. She'd known it before he finished talking. The question was whether she was saying yes because she was cornered or because something in her had decided. She thought about how he'd looked at her, not at her size, not at the dress or the cabin or the arithmetic of her situation, at her. Like she was the specific point of the thing he had actually come for. She thought about Clara's beetle on the rock, moving without deliberation toward warmth. Not brave exactly, just clear on what she needed. Toward dawn, she made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like arriving at the only honest conclusion the evidence supported. And underneath the fear and the practicality and the hard arithmetic of it, something small and stubborn said, "He looked at you. He looked straight at you. Pay attention to that." She paid attention to it, and she decided. He came back in 2 days, exactly as promised. The wagon was already loaded when she opened the door. 2 horses, dark bay and strong, nothing like the rented animals that passed through Harrow Creek. Crates in the wagon bed secured with knots that were even and tight and very deliberate. She noted the knots. They were the knots of someone who cared about not losing things. He stood in the cold morning with his hat in both hands and waited. Just waited, giving her the space to arrive at her own moment without rushing it. "I'm going," she said. He nodded once, a nod that understood the weight of those words and didn't try to reduce it. She had one bag. She had said goodbye to Walt privately in the few minutes before dawn when the house was still sleeping, had stood beside his chair and held his hand and said the things that needed saying without making them bigger than the moment could hold. She had held Denny by the shoulders and told him to mind Mrs. Sutton and to keep his pockets free of livestock. She had let Clara hold on to her for a long time, the way Clara held on to things she wasn't ready to let go of completely, without self-consciousness, with the whole of herself. She had not let herself cry. She had decided that before the day started, and she held to it. She walked to the wagon, climbed up onto the wooden seat without help. The cold came through her coat immediately. Jasper climbed up onto the other side, gathered the reins, clicked his tongue. The wagon moved. She did not look back. She knew her father was in the doorway, could feel the particular weight of his watching, and she knew that if she turned and saw his face, she might not be able to go. And if she didn't go, the bank would take everything before Christmas, and her family would have nothing, and all his shame would have been for something worse than this. She faced forward, the road, the trees. The mountains ahead, pale and enormous in the morning light far away, and patient and completely indifferent to the smallness of what was happening below them. She faced forward and went. The first day was mostly flat road and steady grade. Cold but manageable, the dry kind, the kind that doesn't soak in. The horses moved with the quiet purpose of good animals who knew the route. They didn't talk much. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, just what it was, 2 people who didn't know each other well enough to feel quiet naturally sensible enough not to try. He offered food at midday. Dried meat and bread, better bread than she'd been eating. She ate without ceremony, and he did the same. No performance, no attempt to be charming. She appreciated that more than she'd have expected. The second day was harder. The road narrowed. Dense timber closed in the trunks dark and close, the sky reduced to a strip of blue directly above. The wagon lurched and jolted over root and rock, and Willa held the seat with both hands and watched him work the reins. She noticed things. She couldn't help it. Noticing things was a survival mechanism built over years of needing to read situations accurately before they became problems. And what she noticed about Jasper Holt built up slowly, detail by detail, into a picture that required explanation. His boots. She kept returning to his boots. Under the mud that caked them heavily, she could see when it cracked as he stepped down to handle the horses around a difficult section, the construction underneath. Tight stitching, good leather. The stitching alone was expensive. Not new money, but old money, the kind of quality built to last a decade. The kind you bought once and kept. The way he handled the reins, like a man managing something that was his. Not carefully the way you manage something borrowed, but with the casual authority of ownership. Easy, unthought. And when he looked up at the ridgeline, which he did often systematically scanning rock and tree line, his shoulders had a particular quality. Not vigilance, something more like the posture of a man checking on property. Surveying. She thought about that. The third morning she stopped accumulating observations and spoke. "You're not poor," she said. Not a question. She'd learned that questions gave people room to maneuver. He was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. "What makes you say that?" he said. "Your boots. The stitching cost more than my father's mule. I can see it through the mud when it cracks. The way you hold the reins like a man who owns good stock and is used to better roads than this. The crates in the back that you've mentioned exactly nothing about, which a genuinely poor man would have explained by now because poor men keep track of everything they own." She paused. "And the way you look at the ridge line, like you're checking on something." He turned and looked at her. Something moved in those pale gray eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man recalibrating quickly after discovering he has underestimated someone. "Some things," he said carefully, "make more sense when they're seen than when they're described." "That's not an answer." "No, it isn't." She held his gaze. He held hers back, didn't look away, didn't redirect to the road. "I'll find out," she said, "whatever it is." "Yes," he said quietly, "you will." The third day the land changed. Heavy pine gave way to aspen white-barked bare at this time of year, their empty branches making fine dark patterns against a pale sky. Then the aspen gave way to open rockstone pushing through the thin soil like something old insisting on being remembered. The wind sharpened. It carried altitude in it now and intent. Willa's cheeks went numb. Her fingers inside her gloves became blunt and unreliable. She pulled her shawl closer and thought about Clara's beetle making its quiet, certain way toward warmth, and wished she had even a small portion of that particular confidence. They came to the pass in the late afternoon. Two walls of pale stone rising on either side, the space between them narrow enough that the wagon cleared the rock by inches. The horses picked through carefully. Above the sky between the stone walls was deep, cold blue. Jasper drew the team to a stop just before they cleared the gap, sat there without moving, without speaking, looking at the open space ahead with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, tightening the look of someone preparing for a specific kind of consequence. "Something wrong," she said. "No," still looking forward. "Just on the other side of this, things will be different than you're expecting." "Different how?" He turned to her, and in those pale gray eyes she saw what 3 days of careful observation had not shown her: fear. Not the fear of bad roads or difficult weather. Personal fear. The kind that lives in the chest and is about something that matters. "Different in a way I should have told you about before we left," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." The first time he'd used her name. It landed differently than she expected. She opened her mouth to ask him to explain. He clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward through the pass before she could speak. The stone walls fell away on either side and the valley opened below them. All at once, not gradually all at once the way a secret comes out. It was wide and deep and hidden, cupped completely by the slopes around it. A river ran through the center, taking the late afternoon light in pieces and holding them. Meadows spread between the stands of timber, still holding color this close to winter. Everything very still. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty, that feels deliberate, protected, chosen. It was the most beautiful thing Willa had ever seen. And then she saw the house, not a cabin, not a homestead. A house. 2 full stories of heavy log and pale Colorado stone. Broad porches wrapping both levels. Tall windows returning the last light in amber flashes. 5 chimneys, she counted them twice with smoke lifting from 3. Outbuildings spread across the valley floor in orderly arrangement. Barns, sheds, fenced pasture with good straight fence lines, a long low building that was probably quarters for workers. A gravel drive ran from the front steps of the house to the road where they now sat. On those front steps several people stood waiting. Willa's mind went down to essentials the way it did when there was simply too much arriving at once. This is not the home of a poor man. This is not the home of any kind of poor man. This is the home of someone with money. Real money, old or new doesn't matter. "What is happening?" She started. "The valley is called Aldrave Valley," he said. His voice was perfectly level, practiced level. She heard it now, the quality of something that had been rehearsed. "The house is Aldrave House." She waited. "My real name," he said, "is Jasper Aldrave. This is my home, and I meant what I said. It's yours now, too." The horses moved down the drive on their own, knowing the way. The house grew larger. The people on the steps came into focus, a man in good work clothes, a woman in an apron, 2 others behind them. Willa sat on the wagon seat and felt something move through her chest that was not joy and not fear and not relief. Rage, quiet and cold and very precisely located. The kind that doesn't make noise because it doesn't need to. The kind that knows exactly what it is and what it's about and has no interest in performance. He had not technically lied. He'd said he had land, he did. He'd said he had work, he did. He'd said he needed a practical woman, he did. Every individual statement was true, and none of it had been honest. There is a difference. Willa Fenn Briggs had been alive long enough and overlooked enough to know exactly what that difference felt like from the receiving end. She gripped the side of the wagon, breathed once through her nose slow. The wagon stopped in front of the house. The man in good work clothes came forward. "Mr. Aldrave?" A nod. "Everything's ready inside." And Jasper Aldrave, because that was his name, his real name, and she was going to have to learn to hear it changed. Not dramatically, just settled into himself differently. Shoulders down, chin up, the worn coat exactly the same, but the man inside it reorganized in a way that changed everything about how it sat. He no longer looked like a man asking for a place in the world. He looked like the man who owned one. Aldrave House smelled like cedar and bread from an oven, and the particular clean warmth of a place where things were regularly maintained by people who were paid to maintain them. The front hall was paneled in dark wood the color of old honey. The great room beyond held a stone fireplace burning steady and high at its far end. Rugs so thick Willa's boots made no sound on the floor. Furniture built by craftsmen. Paintings between the tall windows, mountains and rivers and valley scenes that she realized after a moment depicted this valley in different seasons. Someone had loved this place enough to have it painted over and over. She walked in slowly. She was careful not to touch anything. Her hands knew rough boards and chipped tin and the splintered handle of a garden hoe. This was so far from any of that, so completely far that she felt like a person who had wandered into someone else's story and was waiting to be noticed and redirected to her own. A woman in a white apron brought tea on a tray. Real porcelain, thin and white with small painted flowers at the rim. Willa wrapped both hands around the cup and held it. Didn't drink yet. Was honestly afraid of it, afraid of the fragility of it, afraid of being the thing that broke something she could never afford to replace, which was, she caught herself, absurd. He could replace the entire set without thinking about it. He could probably replace the room. She drank the tea. When the woman left, the room went quiet except for the fire. Jasper stood across from her. She had not seen him in a room like this. He looked right in it the way you look right in a place you've lived your whole life. Unhurried. At home in his own skin. And he looked afraid. That surprised her more than any of the rest. Not afraid of roads or cold or her pointed questions. Personal afraid. The kind that lives behind the eyes when something that matters might be lost. "There are things I didn't tell you," he said. "I want to explain them now." She set down the cup. "Yes," she said. "You do." He talked. She listened. She was very good at listening. It was one of the things she did instead of the softer skills she'd never had time to develop. His father, Garrett Aldrave, had built the Aldrave Timber Company across 30 years. Forests and mills in this valley assembled piece by a man who knew exactly what he wanted and never stopped moving toward it. When Garrett died 4 years ago, everything had passed to Jasper. Land Mills Company House. The name, and with the name everything attached to it. In Denver, Aldrave meant money, and money meant that every face turned toward him was already calculating something before it finished turning. Women in drawing rooms whose smiles reached their mouths but not their eyes. Men at dinners who wanted contracts, access, favors. His father's associates who saw a young man in an established position and thought the position was negotiable. His father's sister Cecilia, now Cecilia Hargrove, who had been involved in the company's early years through her husband's investment and had never quite let go of that involvement even after her husband died. He had grown tired, he said, of feeling like a property, like something that belonged to whoever could make the most compelling argument for ownership. So he had gone into the high country in rough clothes and a borrowed name, looking for someone real, someone who would see what was actually there underneath the money and the name and what those things promised. And he had found her. In July, at the county fair. He had watched her step in front of Clara without hesitation, without thinking about how it looked, and he had decided. He had not introduced himself, had found out who she was, had learned about her family and their situation, had made his plan. He stopped talking. Outside, the valley was going blue in the early dark. "You watched me," she said. "Yes," without telling me. "Yes, you learned about my family, about the debt. You came to my door knowing I had almost no choices left, and you made an offer designed specifically to fit around what I had and what I needed." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew it was yes. "I don't care that you have money," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided sometime between the pass and now that this was not a moment for noise. "That is not what I'm angry about." "I know," he said. "I'm angry because you took away my ability to choose honestly. You arranged everything, the information I had, the options available to me, the timing, so that there was really only one move I could make. And then you stood back and told yourself I'd made it freely." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "that is exactly what I did." He held the truth of that. Didn't qualify it. Didn't reach for something to make it smaller. Just held it and kept looking at her, which was the right thing to do. Which didn't make it all right. But it was the right thing. "I need some air," she said. She went out onto the porch. The valley had gone dark except for the peaks which held a last strip of pale gold. The river caught what light was left and kept it. She stood and breathed. The air at this altitude was different, thinner, cleaner. It made you feel the inside of your lungs. She breathed it deliberately. Let it be real. She was not going to leave. She had made a choice, and she would live inside it. She was not a person who cut and ran from what she'd decided she'd learned too young, what that kind of inconstancy cost. But she was angry, and the anger was not about punishment, it was about honesty. Because if anything between them was going to be real, it needed to begin from truth, not his careful arrangements, actual truth. She heard his footsteps on the boards behind her. "Are you going to do this again?" she said before he could speak. "Make decisions about my life and present me with the results." He thought about it, didn't answer until he'd checked himself. "No," he said. "Then we start from here. Whatever this is, we build it from here. Both of us in the room when the decisions are made." Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held shut for a long time, opening the smallest amount. "All right," he said. The last light left the peaks. The valley went dark and still, just the sound of the river and the wind somewhere above in the pines. Willa Fenn Briggs stood on the porch of Aldrave House and understood for the first time clearly the full weight of what she'd entered. She didn't know about Cecilia yet, didn't know about Roland Fitch or the documents in the library or the particular way power moved in the world of men who owned timber companies and conducted business in Denver drawing rooms. She knew one thing, solid and hers. She was not going to shrink for this place. She was not going to become less of herself to fit inside it. She was going to take up the space she took up, and whatever came next would have to make room. The first morning at Aldrave House, Willa woke before the sun. Old habit. Unbreakable. Her body didn't know how to sleep past the first gray light no matter what kind of bed it was in, and this bed was well. It was something else entirely. Soft in a way she had no real reference for. Warm all the way through the warmth of good wool and down not the thin, desperate warmth of a body trying to make an insufficient blanket work. She lay still for 3 seconds. Then she got up, because some habits aren't about necessity. They're about who you are. The house was different in the early morning, less imposing when no one was moving through it with purpose and authority. She dressed in her own clothes, plain wool, washed so many times the color had gone soft and gentle, and walked the halls in her stockinged feet, learning the place the way she learned everything by direct examination. Which stair creaked, which window let in draft, where the cold collected in corners. She found the kitchen by smell. A cook named Berta was already at work, a solid woman around 50 with hands like Willa's own, work-shaped, practical. Berta looked at her, at the plain dress and unbraided hair and bare feet. "Coffee's on," she said. "Neutral, neither warm nor cold, informational." "Thank you," Willa said. She poured her own cup and sat at the work table rather than going to the dining room because the dining room had 8 chairs and sitting at the head of a table with 8 chairs. When you were one person felt like a bad joke about yourself. Berta said nothing about this, kept working. After perhaps 15 minutes she set a plate of biscuits on the table between them, without comment, without looking at Willa. Willa ate one. "Good," she said. Berta's expression shifted by approximately 3 degrees in a direction that might have been satisfaction. It was, Willa decided later, the beginning of a workable understanding. Jasper found her outside after breakfast, inspecting the outbuildings. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "I know. I wasn't sure if—" "I don't change because the bed is different." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, "not even slightly." He walked with her. Through the barn, 8 horses, well-kept good animals. Through the equipment shed, along the fence line. He talked as they walked, not because she asked, but because he understood she thought that information was what she needed right now, more than comfort or reassurance, or anything softer. The timber operation ran from 3 sites in the upper valley. Seasonal crews. The mill was 2 miles north along the river. Cattle in the summer meadows. A smaller year-round crew for maintenance and supply. "And the school," Willa said. He stopped. "What?" "Small building east of the workers' quarters. Chalkboard visible through the window." "Yes?" Something in his face softened, the specific softening of someone who actually cares about a thing and is being asked about it unexpectedly. Workers' children. 7 students last season. A teacher from Denver. She stayed through spring. And this season. No teacher yet. Willa filed that away, said nothing, kept walking. The days found a rhythm. Not quickly, not naturally, but the way rhythms always find themselves through repetition and adjustment and the slow weight of shared hours. She learned which houseman ran the inside of Aldrave House with systematic precision and that the best way to earn his respect was to treat him like a person rather than a fixture. She started asking questions about wages, about the workers' housing, about the draft in the west-facing quarters that had apparently been reported and not addressed for 2 winters. Jasper answered everything, without deflection, without managing what she was given access to. He had not misled her since the first night, or rather, since the night the truth had been required of him. He hadn't withheld anything she asked about. That wasn't the same as full transparency, but it was something. It was a man trying. She noticed him trying. She didn't say so, but she noticed. On the 5th day, she asked about the timber practices, specifically whether the current cutting rotation gave the slopes above the river enough time to regenerate before the next crew moved through. He told her honestly, not always. Not as consistently as it should. She asked why. He said the contracts with Denver suppliers ran on 2-year cycles, and pressure to produce volume inside those windows sometimes pushed the foreman to cut faster than the land could bear. What happens to the slopes, she said. The hillside above the eastern creek has been slow to recover. Spring floods have been worse the last 2 years. The road below it washed out in April. Whose road? Everyone's, but mostly the workers' families use it to get supplies. She looked at him for a long moment. The people producing the timber, she said, are losing their road because of how the timber is being produced. He was quiet. Yes, he said. She filed that away. It was all connected. The cutting rights Roland wanted, the clause in the will, the board votes, the workers' washed-out road. One thing seen from several angles, and the people who paid most for it had the least say in how it worked. She understood that pattern in her bones. The evenings were the strangest part. They would sit after dinner on opposite sides of the great room fireplace, him with company papers and correspondence, her with books from the library. A real library. 3 walls of books that she had stood in front of the first time, with her heart doing something embarrassing. And the fire would burn, and the valley would go quiet outside, and it would feel in those moments almost like something, which unsettled her. She was not supposed to be comfortable yet. She was supposed to still be angry, and she was underneath. She hadn't forgotten. But comfort crept in around the edges of anger the way water finds stone. Patient. Not asking permission. She would watch him across the fire sometimes when he was focused on his papers and not watching back. And think, who is this person actually? Underneath the money and the careful management and those pale gray eyes that always looked straight at her. The money was real. The house was real. The weight of what he'd inherited, not just land and mills, but an entire structure of obligations and competing interests, was real too. He hadn't built it. He'd been handed it and was trying to run it honorably in a world that kept offering him easier, more profitable alternatives. She understood that. In a different register, from a very different position, she understood exactly what it was to be handed a situation you hadn't made and have to figure out how to live inside it without losing yourself in the process. She was beginning to think she recognized the shape of his difficulty, even if the scale of it was beyond anything she had reference points for. She was still finding out. She found the papers on the 8th day. She was in the library looking for a surveyor's account of the Upper Rockies she'd noticed on her first walk through, had been thinking about it since, had finally made time. She found it, and beside it, stacked flat on the shelf, rather than standing upright, a folder that had slipped from its place and lay half open. She would have put it back without reading it, except the top sheet had her name on it. Willa Fenn Briggs Aldrave, in official printed type. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up the folder. She had learned to read legal documents out of necessity starting at 16 when the first bank notices came, and her father's hands shook too badly to hold the papers steady. She had taught herself the specific grammar of threat and obligation, the language of men with power over other people's lives expressed through official ink. She read fast. The folder contained a full copy of Garrett Aldrave's will, and beside it a series of legal letters from a Denver firm, formal, deliberate, addressed to a Cecilia Hargrove, Jasper's aunt. She read the letters twice, once for facts, once for what the facts meant. Then she stood in the library for a long moment with the folder in her hands and understood something that changed the shape of everything she thought she was navigating. This was not just about her. It had never been just about her, or even just about Jasper. The will contained a clause, a protection mechanism for the board of directors, with Cecilia Hargrove holding 2 decisive votes through inherited proxies to challenge the leadership of any Aldrave heir who demonstrated what the document called impaired judgment in matters affecting company stability. A marriage to a woman with no family name, no financial standing, no social credentials in the circles where Aldrave Timber conducted business. That was their argument. That was what they were building. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it, straightened the shelf, walked out of the library, and went to find Jasper. He was in the equipment yard. He looked up when he saw her face and said something brief to the foreman beside him, and the foreman stepped away. "Tell me about Cecilia," she said. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "What do you know?" he said. "I found the will and the letters from the Denver firm." He looked at the mountains above the valley, then back at her. "How long have you known they were planning this?" she said. "Since before I came to Harrow Creek." The cold felt colder. "Before," she said. "Yes." "So when you came to my door, when you made your offer, you already knew your aunt was building a legal case. You knew that marrying someone marrying me was going to be the ammunition they used." "Yes, and you didn't tell me." "No, I didn't," she breathed. Once, through her nose, slow. "Why?" "Because I didn't want it to be part of your decision. I didn't want you coming with me or refusing to because of my legal situation. You wanted to control the information again," she said, "so I'd make the choice you needed." The words landed between them. He didn't argue. He couldn't. It was true. "Yes," he said quietly, the quietest she'd heard him. "I am getting very tired," she said, "of being managed." "I know. I am not a piece on your board, Jasper." "I know that. Do you? Because this is the second time you've made significant decisions about my life and handed me the outcome instead of the process. There cannot be a third time. Do you understand me?" He met her eyes without flinching. "There won't be," he said. She believed him. Not because he was charming about it, he wasn't. Because he held what she'd said without trying to redistribute the weight of it. He just held it. And that, for now, was the only thing she knew how to trust. "Tell me everything," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." "All right. Now." "Yes," he said. "Now." They walked the valley while he talked 2 miles out and 2 miles back, mountains above them, river alongside. He told her everything. Cecilia Hargrove had been part of Aldrave Timber since the early years when her husband Arthur's investment had helped fund Garrett's first mill. Arthur had died 9 years ago. The investment and its board influence had remained with Cecilia. She held 2 proxy votes, not officially, but everyone understood whose votes they were. Roland Fitch was newer, 3 years. A Denver investor with Eastern connections and very good manners, and an interest in Colorado timber that went considerably beyond what he disclosed in board discussions. He wanted cutting rights to the Upper Valley, serious rights, the kind that would strip 30 miles of forest in 2 years and make significant money doing it. Jasper had refused him twice. The impaired judgment clause in the will had been standard language when the document was drafted, a protection against reckless heirs. Cecilia and Roland had found it and spent over a year consulting legal counsel about how to activate it. Their argument: Jasper had gone into the mountains in disguise, had married a woman with no name, no money, no fitness for the role, had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment the clause was designed to address. "And if they succeed," Willa said. She knew the answer. She wanted to hear him say it. "They get controlling interest. Fitch gets his cutting rights. The Upper Valley gets stripped." He looked at the timber line above the meadow. "My father spent 30 years building something worth building. I won't let them take it apart in 2. She walked beside him in silence. "You need me to be unimpeachable," she said. "I need you to be yourself," he said. "Those aren't the same thing. They're going to look like the same thing to them, probably." He stopped, turned to face her. "But I want to be clear. If you decide this is too much, if what you've walked into isn't what you agreed to, I'll still keep every promise I made. Your father's debt, your family's stability, all of it, whatever you choose." She studied him. "You'd let me walk away," she said. "I'd let you choose. There's a difference." He paused. "I'd prefer that you'd been told all of this before you made your first choice. I can't fix that. I can only make sure this choice is made with everything in the open." She looked at the peaks, the timber, the long, dark line of the high country. "You know what's hardest about this?" she said. "What?" "I'm still deciding whether I'm angry at you." She looked back at him. "And it would be considerably easier to stay angry if you kept doing the wrong thing." Something moved across his face, almost a smile. "I'll try to be more consistently objectionable," he said. "You do that?" she said, and turned back toward the house. 3 days after that conversation, the carriage arrived. She heard it before she saw it, the smooth quality of expensive wheels on gravel, a sound she was beginning to distinguish from the rougher sound of working wagons. She was on the front porch and stayed there. Black carriage, 4 dark bay horses, matched and well kept, 2 men on the bench. It came up the drive with a quiet authority that she recognized immediately as performance. Everything about it was designed to communicate something before anyone opened their mouth. Cecilia Hargrove stepped out first, 57 years old, tall, a traveling cloak the deep blue of a river in winter, hair pinned with absolute precision, not a strand loose. She moved with the economy of a woman who had spent decades making sure her presence was felt before she spoke. Behind her, Roland Fitch, 56, silver at his temples. A very good coat. Clean boots, she checked. She couldn't help it. She checked everyone's boots now and was beginning to find this habit faintly amusing that had never seen a rough road. Behind Roland, a younger man with a leather case. Lawyer. She could spot them by the way they held things. Cecilia's eyes found Willa on the porch. The look that followed was thorough. The plain wool dress, the work boots, the auburn hair, the weight of her. All of it. In the time it takes to draw one breath. "You must be Willa," Cecilia said. Her voice was lovely. Low and warm and precisely controlled like a temperature that had been maintained exactly for a very long time. "I am," Willa said. "What a surprise." She smiled. "Jasper said very little in his letter. I had to hear about the marriage from others." A small pause, surgical in its precision. "Not how I hoped to learn my nephew had married." "People talk," Willa said. Cecilia's smile held its position exactly. "They certainly do," she agreed. Inside the great room filled with a different quality of air. These were people accustomed to large rooms. They moved through Aldrave House without being impressed by it, which told Willa something they'd been in houses at least this good, which meant they were measuring this one against a standard, which meant they were already calculating. She positioned herself by the window back to the light. Old instinct. She wanted to see their faces. Roland moved through the room with his hands clasped behind him, looking at the paintings and the bookshelves with the attention of a man conducting a valuation. Because that's exactly what he was doing. Cecilia sat in the chair with the best sightlines, not the largest, the one positioned to see everything, and accepted tea without acknowledging the person who brought it, which told Willa everything she needed to know. People who don't see the people who serve them don't see a great many things. They filter out whatever doesn't serve a purpose. "The company is in an interesting position," Roland began. His voice was smooth in the way of something that had been practiced rather than grown. "The opportunities we've discussed previously, the opportunities haven't changed since I last declined them," Jasper said. "The climate has—" "Roland, quiet, final. We're not in a board meeting." Roland smiled. The smile of someone who knows how to wait. Cecilia set her teacup on the saucer with precision. "Center." "Exactly. I'll be direct," she said. "Since we're family." She turned to Willa, not aggressively but completely making Willa the center of the room without warning. "My dear, do you understand the position you've been placed in?" "I understand my position fine," Willa said. "The company has obligations, social ones as much as financial." Cecilia's tone stayed warm, perfectly consistently warm, like a fire that never fluctuates. "The investors Jasper works with, the officials he needs access to, they have expectations. Not cruel ones. Simply realities. A woman in his position requires a certain kind of foundation. Family name, social education, an understanding of how things function in particular rooms." She tilted her head slightly. "You are clearly a capable woman, clearly strong. But one kind of strength doesn't always translate." Willa looked at her, then at Roland. Then at the lawyer with his case examining a painting he had no interest in. "That's kind of you to say," Willa said. "Clearly." Cecilia blinked, once, just slightly. "We only want what's best for Jasper," Roland said, stepping in smoothly. "Of course," Willa said, and she smiled. Because sometimes the most useful thing is to smile and be quiet and let other people fill the silence with whatever they're carrying. After Cecilia and Roland retired to their guest rooms and the house went quiet, Willa sat in the library with the will in her lap. She had asked Jasper for it directly after dinner. He had given it to her without hesitation or question, which meant he understood why she wanted it, which meant he was paying attention in the right direction. She read the whole document, every clause. She was looking for what Roland had carefully not mentioned in the drawing room, the thing he'd worked around in his smooth, measured voice, the thing Cecilia had left unspoken beneath her warm, careful words. She found it on page 11. The impaired judgment clause was there, yes, clear and usable. But running alongside it, drafted with equal legal weight, was something else entirely. A mechanism. A path. A marriage could be protected from challenge under the will's own terms if the spouse demonstrated meaningful contribution to the public life of the Colorado Territory, recognized by a civic official, of standing in a way that could be shown to strengthen rather than undermine the company's relationship with the communities where it operated. Willa read it 3 times, then sat with it. The Denver governor's reception was in 12 days. She knew because Roland had mentioned it in the casual way people mention things they want you to think are casual. Every person of importance in the territory would be there. It was not just a social occasion. It was the stage where this particular drama was going to be performed. Roland and Cecilia intended to use it as the moment of public exposure, the moment they revealed the legal challenge in front of everyone who mattered. She closed the will. She sat in the quiet library with the fire burning low and the valley silent outside and understood something with perfect clarity. Page 11 was a weapon, and she had exactly the right hands for it. She told Jasper the next morning, outside in the frost before the house was fully awake. "I'm going to Denver with you," she said. "You don't have to, Jasper." She used his name the way she'd started using it with weight, deliberately. "Read the will again. Page 11. The second clause. The one Roland didn't mention." "I've read the will. Did you read that clause?" He was quiet. "Yes," he said. And I didn't want to ask you to—" "You're not asking me. I'm deciding. You said you understood the difference. Understand it now." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything about the reception. Who matters? What Roland is planning, when he's planning it." She pulled her coat against the morning cold. "I need to know the ground before I walk onto it." And Jasper Aldrave, who had spent weeks managing information, arranging things, making decisions in rooms where Willa wasn't present, looked at his wife in the frost light of a November morning and did something that was harder for him than any road he'd ridden. He started talking, and he didn't stop until she had everything. The next 12 days were preparation. A seamstress named Ruth came up from town and worked in Willa's room for 3 days straight. Small woman. Said very little, listened carefully. Professional or curious, probably some of both. The dress they built together was green, deep forest green, the color of the pines after rain, because Willa had said plainly that she was not going to wear the pale colors that Denver drawing rooms favored. Pale was not the right word for anything she was trying to say. Ruth had looked at her for a moment, then pulled out a bolt of silk the color of the high country in summer and held it up. "Yes," Willa said. "That." The cut was simple. Nothing that would catch in a doorway or require help to manage or make it hard to breathe. She needed to move freely, stand freely, think without distraction. Ruth understood. She made the dress accordingly. In the evenings, Jasper went over the company papers with her. The actual papers, ledgers, contracts, correspondence, the whole shape of Aldrave timber. He explained without condescension, asked questions as often as he answered them. When she pointed out something she didn't understand, he explained it. When she pointed out something she thought was wrong, he listened. Once she found a discrepancy in the mill supply figures. He looked at it for a long moment. "I've been over these numbers for 3 weeks," he said. "I've been reading debt notices since I was 16, she said. "You learn to see wrong numbers fast when they carry consequences." He had it corrected by morning. Ruth had made one observation on the second day of fitting that Willa had not forgotten. They were working on the line of the bodice, adjusting for Willa's actual shape rather than the shape a dress of this kind usually assumed, and Ruth had said, without looking up from her pins, "Most women I fit in Denver, they want the dress to make them look smaller. They want it to do work, hide things." Willa had waited. "You want to be able to breathe," Ruth said. "That's different." It was different. It was exactly the point, though Willa hadn't articulated it that way before hearing it. She didn't want the dress to do work for her. She wanted the dress to stay out of the way while she did her own work. She wanted to be able to stand in a room without the fabric making demands on her attention, without tugging, without restricting, without requiring her to think about it. She wanted to just be able to be there, in the room, without apology and without armor. Which was, she was beginning to understand, the only way she had ever actually known how to show up anywhere. The night before they left, she stood on the porch. The valley was perfectly still. River invisible but audible, its patient, continuous sound. Mountains as dark shapes against stars so numerous they seemed to crowd each other. She'd been here 3 weeks. 21 days since she'd left Harrow Creek with one bag and a decision made by a guttering candle. She thought about Walt. Whether his breathing had eased any. Whether Denny had kept his pockets clear of things that moved on their own. Whether Clara had started a new project of scientific observation. She thought about Denver and what waited in it. Not fear exactly. The particular sensation of standing before something large with only yourself as resource. No name, no history, no social credentials. Just everything she was, which the world had spent her entire life telling her was not quite sufficient for the room she needed to enter. She breathed the mountain air, let it fill her completely. She heard the door open. Jasper's footsteps. She knew them now, had learned them the way you learn the sounds of a place you're beginning to belong to. "We leave at dawn," he said. "I know." He stood beside her, looking at the same dark valley, the same stars. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "At the fair in July, when you stepped in front of Clara." He stopped, started again. "I have spent my entire adult life in rooms full of people performing, calculating advantage, saying what needs to be said to get what needs to be gotten. I had forgotten, genuinely forgotten, that people existed who just did the thing that needed doing, without calculation, without performing it." A pause. "I needed to be reminded that those people were real." She looked at the dark peaks. "That's considerable weight to put on one moment," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but it was the right moment." She was quiet for a bit. "Jasper." "Yes." "When Denver is behind us, when all of this is settled, we're going to have a real conversation about how things work between us, about decisions and information and who knows what and when." She looked at him. "Agreed." "Agreed," he said. "Good." She looked back at the stars. "Get some sleep." She stayed on the porch after he went in. The cold was serious, the kind that had no patience for sentiment, the kind you stand in anyway because some things are worth the temperature. She thought about what she was worth. She was beginning for the first time clearly to have an answer to that. Denver hit her like a fist, not violently, not cruelly, just suddenly, the way a fist lands before you finish deciding whether to brace for it. The noise first. After 3 weeks where the loudest sound was the river and the occasional dispute between Jay's, Denver was an assault. Wagons on cobblestone. Horses on cobblestone, men calling across streets, women calling from doorways. A train whistle somewhere behind the buildings, long and low and perfectly indifferent to every human concern in its vicinity. Then the smell. Coal smoke. Horse. Perfume from an open shop door. Roasting meat. The particular muddy smell of a city recently rained on and not yet dried. Then the scale. Brick buildings 4 and 5 stories pressing close to the street. Telegraph lines crossing above everything like dark stitching holding the sky in place. People moving in all directions with the purposeful focus of people who had somewhere to be and were already running slightly late. Willa sat in the carriage and watched it come at her through the window and thought, "All right. This is what it is." She breathed. Once. All right. The hotel was the Larimer Grand, a name that wanted you to know something before you walked through the door. She walked through it anyway. Lobby warm. Gaslights burning even in the afternoon, women in silk, men in dark suits talking in low, important tones, piano from somewhere unhurried and accomplished music being used as furniture. She felt the room's measurement of her immediately. She always could. 24 years of being measured had given her an almost physical sensitivity to it. And this room was measuring everything that entered against a standard it took very seriously. This room was considerably grander than the rooms that had measured her before. Jasper took her hand. She hadn't expected that. He was not generally a demonstrative man, operated in a register of restraint she'd come to understand as the habit of a person who'd learned not to perform emotion for audiences. But he took her hand. In the lobby of the Larimer Grand, in front of everyone who was measuring. "You've managed blizzards coming off the high range," he said quietly. "You've dealt with men with cold eyes and harder intentions. You have never once let any of it move you from where you were standing." He looked at her. "These people have never heard a wolf cry across open snow. They've never stood between a storm and the people they loved. You have nothing to learn from them about courage." She looked at him. He meant it. He was not performing reassurance, was telling her a true thing because it was true and she needed to hear it, and he had decided that telling her was the right thing to do. "You're getting better at that," she said. "At what?" "Saying the right thing at the right time." Something in his face, almost a smile. "I've had a good teacher," he said. She let go of his hand and walked toward the desk. Their rooms were on the 3rd floor. Large windows, a working fireplace, and a full-length mirror in a dark wood frame. She stood in front of it. The woman in the green dress looked back at her. Broad shoulders, solid, the weight of her present and undeniable and not making any apology for itself. Auburn hair pinned properly with Ruth's careful help that morning. The green of the dress against the auburn of her hair was actually right. Ruth had known what she was doing with that color. She was not beautiful in the way that Denver in 1885 understood beautiful. She knew that and had known it for a long time and had made her peace with it mostly in the way you make peace with things you cannot change, and that cost you something every time you think about them. She was something else, something that didn't have a clean word in that vocabulary yet. She thought about what Cecilia had said, one kind of strength doesn't always translate. She thought about every room she'd ever walked into and felt the measuring happen: the trading post in Harrow Creek, the church at Harvest, the county fair in July, when a man had almost knocked Clara down, and Willa had stepped in front of her sister without thinking, and hadn't thought until later that a room full of people had seen her do it. Hadn't thought about how she looked doing it, had just done it. That was apparently something worth noticing. She looked at herself for exactly as long as it took to make a decision. Not the decision about whether to go into the ballroom she was going in regardless. The smaller decision. The one about how, not as a smaller version of herself, not as someone performing adequacy, not as an apology for taking up space in a room that hadn't left any for her, as herself, completely, without reduction. That was the only version she had available, and she was going to use it. She turned from the mirror and went to review Jasper's notes on the reception. The governor's reception was in the ballroom of the Larimer Grand, which had transformed by 7 in the evening into something that wanted very much to be impressive and largely succeeded. High ceilings, chandeliers throwing light everywhere, long tables with white cloths and more food on them than Harrow Creek saw in a month. Women in colors she didn't have names for, deep rose and pale gold, and a blue-gray that existed somewhere between sky and stone. Men in black, which at least simplified things for them. The noise of many important conversations conducted simultaneously, the sound of the room where things were decided. She stood with Jasper in the corridor outside and felt the music coming through the closed doors. A waltz. The kind of music designed to give people something to do with their bodies while their mouths did the real work. She thought about page 11, about Roland Fitch's eyes moving across the rooms of Aldrave House, calculating, about Cecilia's voice warm and controlled as a banked fire saying one kind of strength doesn't always translate. She was going to translate it, right now, in that room. The doorman found their names on his list. Mr. and Mrs. Aldrave, he said, and opened the doors. The ballroom found them immediately. That word Aldrave moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water. Rings spreading outward, eyes turning. The recalibration of a room that has received a piece of information it will spend the next several hours processing. They looked at Jasper first, then at her. She felt every look. The assessment, the calibration, the filing away. She had felt this kind of looking her whole life, and had spent her whole life making herself smaller in response to it, looking away first, taking up less space, letting the judgment land without meeting it. Not tonight. She lifted her chin, not aggressively, not making a statement, just straightening into herself, occupying exactly the height she was, taking up exactly the space she took up and not 1 inch less. She walked into that room on Jasper Aldrave's arm and she looked back. The first 20 minutes were navigation. Men moved toward Jasper with outstretched hands and easy first names, the casualness of familiarity that hadn't quite been earned. Their eyes moved to Willa. Quick, practiced. The look that's doing work but doesn't want to be seen doing it. She met every one of them, steadily, without performance. Just looking back the same quality of attention she'd given to the boot stitching on a wagon seat 3 weeks ago. Some looked away quickly. Some held it. One older man, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who'd actually worked outdoors, rather than just supervised people who did, held her gaze for a full beat and nodded. Slightly. Like he'd seen something he recognized and found worth acknowledging. She filed that away. Cecilia was already positioned near the governor's circle. Red silk tonight, not traveling blue. Red that moved with her like it understood its assignment. Roland Fitch was already there too, speaking with the lawyer from Aldrave House. The leather case was in different hands, but it was the same case. The stage was set. They'd arrived early. Of course. You don't spring a trap you've been building for months without getting there first. Cecilia greeted Jasper with warmth that was genuine in its craft, the most dangerous kind of warmth. She held his hands, said how wonderful, said she was so glad. Then she turned to Willa. "My dear," she said, "same temperature, same control. You look striking. That color is quite bold." "Thank you," Willa said. "I find bold is generally more useful than careful." Something behind Cecilia's smile shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Willa moved through the room. Not toward anyone specific yet. Making stops, speaking to people. A mill owner from Colorado Springs, she talked with him about water rights and how flooding on the eastern slopes was changing the economics of the lower mills. A doctor's wife named Margaret Sharp, funny furious about the absence of medical care in the mountain settlements, who had been thinking about this problem for years with no one to think about it alongside her. These were not performed conversations. They were conversations about things she actually knew, had actually lived with. She was just talking about real things to real people, and people responded to real things, even in silk, even in expensive boots. Underneath the performance of importance, people were still people, and they were interested in truth when they encountered it, because in rooms like this they encountered it so rarely. When she finally reached the governor's circle, Margaret touched the governor's arm and said quietly, "Silas, you should hear what this woman has been saying." Governor Silas Hartwell turned. He was 62, broad-chested with a white mustache and eyes that had spent decades distinguishing what people meant from what they said. He looked at Willa the way the gray-haired man across the room had looked at her, like he was seeing something he recognized. "Mrs. Aldrave," he said. "Governor," she said. "Tell me," he said, "what have you been saying?" She talked for 11 minutes. She knew because she'd been watching the ballroom clock. She'd given herself 10 and went slightly over and didn't apologize for the extra minute because it was necessary. She talked about the mountain settlements, what they needed versus what they had. She talked about timber practices, not abstractly but specifically what happens to a creek when the trees above it come down too fast, what happens to the road that creek crosses when the spring floods change course, what happens to the family whose cabin is on that road when the slide comes. She talked about Aldrave House, about the school that existed and needed a teacher, about the winter medical situation, about wages and housing and the ways a timber company could operate profitably while sustaining that was the word she chose deliberately, the communities and the land it depended on. Not a speech, not a performance. The way she talked to Jasper in the evenings over the ledgers, directly, specifically, without decoration. The circle around her had grown. She hadn't noted when exactly. A judge, 2 legislators, the woman who ran a school in Denver and had been thinking about the mountain settlements for years with no practical path toward action. Governor Hartwell had not moved, had not checked the clock or looked for someone more important. He was listening. She finished. A moment of quiet. The music played on somewhere behind her. "Mrs. Aldrave," the governor said, "for 2 years the territory has needed exactly this, someone who knows the high country from the inside rather than from a survey report or a policy brief." He looked at her directly. "Would you be willing to serve as an advisor on mountain settlement matters, formally appointed, unpaid? I'm afraid the territorial budget, but a real position with real access." Willa looked at him. She thought about page 11. She thought about Roland Fitch's eyes moving through Aldrave House. She thought about Cecilia's voice. One kind of strength doesn't always translate. "Yes," she said, "I would." A secretary stepped forward. She hadn't noticed him on the edge of the circle with a letter already drafted. Territorial seal at the top. The governor had apparently been considering this for some time and had come tonight prepared to offer it to the right person. Her hand trembled once as she took the pen. Once only. Then it held. She signed her name in the careful, deliberate strokes she'd been using since she was 12 years old, writing supply lists by lamplight. Willa Fenn Briggs Aldrave. There it was. She felt Roland Fitch before she saw him, the pressure of someone moving through a crowd with intent, arriving near her with an agenda. She turned as he stepped into the circle. The lawyer was at his shoulder. The leather case was open. He'd timed it. Waited until she was in the largest visible group. Maximum audience. "Forgive the interruption," Roland said. He didn't look like he wanted forgiveness. He looked like a man who had waited a long time for this moment and had arrived at it with satisfaction. "Governor, Mr. Aldrave?" He nodded to both, looked at Willa, did not nod. "There is a matter that must be raised tonight, in the presence of witnesses, given the legal—" "Mr. Fitch," Governor Hartwell's voice was perfectly calm. The calm of a man who has been interrupted by ambitious people many times and has made his peace with it. "You have the floor." The lawyer opened the case. Papers came out. "The will of Garrett Aldrave contains provisions regarding Aldrave Timber's leadership. Provisions we believe have been materially triggered by recent decisions." He paused on that word. Just long enough. "Retained counsel has concluded that the criteria for the judgment clause have been met. We are formally—" "May I see that?" Willa said. Roland stopped. He looked at her. The look of a man who has been proceeding with something and been asked to pause by someone he had not accounted for in the proceeding. "The document," Willa said. "The legal summary. May I see it?" "Mrs. Aldrave, this is a board matter." "I'm the subject of it," she said. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear. "I'd like to see the document that concerns me." A beat. The governor looked at Roland. Roland looked at the governor. He handed her the papers. She read fast. Found the judgment clause on page 3. Already knew it by heart. and found what Roland's careful summary, had she confirmed this with her own eyes, omitted entirely. Page 11. Missing completely from the summary presented to the governor and the room. She handed the document back to Roland. "There's a clause missing," she said. "The summary covers the relevant provisions. It covers the provisions that support your argument," she said. "There is another provision in the original will that your summary doesn't address. The one on page 11. Concerning the conditions under which a marriage is protected from challenge rather than subject to it." She turned to the governor's secretary. "The Territorial Archive would have a copy of the will on record," she said, "filed when the company registered in Colorado." The secretary looked at the governor. The governor nodded. "We would, yes. The clause on page 11, Willa said, turning to address the full circle of people now watching with total attention, states that a marriage is affirmed and protected from legal challenge when the spouse demonstrates meaningful public contribution to the Colorado Territory recognized by a civic official of standing. She looked at Roland Fitch. "The governor has just appointed me as territorial advisor on mountain settlements and high country land management in the presence of this room." Silence. The waltz continued somewhere behind them, going around and around in complete ignorance of what had just shifted. Roland's lawyer turned to page 11 of his own copy. "Read it." His expression, which had been composed and professional, did something complicated. "That is," he started. "That is the clause," Willa said, "exactly as written." The lawyer looked at Roland. Roland looked at the document. The document looked back with its official ink and its complete indifference to his plans. Governor Hartwell cleared his throat. The gentle, deliberate clearing of a powerful man who wants everyone in the room to pay attention. "The matter Mr. Fitch has raised," he said, "appears to be settled under the will's own terms. The appointment stands. The marriage is affirmed." He looked at Roland with the eyes of a man who has watched ambitious people overreach many times. "Is there anything else requiring attention tonight?" Roland Fitch opened his mouth, closed it, opened it, closed it. He picked up his papers, handed them to the lawyer, turned and walked back into the crowd. Not quickly, not dramatically, just away the controlled exit of a man who has identified a strategic retreat and is executing it. The lawyer followed. The circle around Willa quietly exhaled. From across the room, the gray-haired man with the weathered face who had nodded at her earlier, came the sound of two hands clapping, slow and deliberate, and one of the legislators joined him, then Margaret, the doctor's wife, then someone else. Governor Hartwell did not clap. He was too dignified for that, but he looked at Willa Fenn Briggs Aldrave with something in his expression she had not often seen in the faces of powerful men. Respect, simple and genuine. "Welcome to the Territory's business," he said. She found the balcony 20 minutes later, not looking for Cecilia, just needing air. Real air, not the warm, perfumed air of the ballroom that was beginning to feel complicated. She went through the glass doors and found the knight, and Cecilia was already there, standing at the railing, looking out over Denver's lights. Alone. The red silk very still. Willa almost turned around. Didn't. She went to the railing, stood beside her, looked out at the same lights, gas lamps and windows, and the dark shapes of buildings against a sky that was never quite dark this close to the city. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Well," Cecilia said finally. Her voice was different. Not the warm, controlled voice of the great room. Quieter. The voice of someone who is not performing because there's no one left to perform for. "Well," Willa agreed. More silence. "You read the will more carefully than Roland did," Cecilia said. "I've been reading documents that determined the shape of my family's life since I was 16, Willa said. "You learn to read carefully when you can't afford to miss anything." Cecilia's hands on the railing, the rings on her fingers catching the light from the ballroom behind them. "I want to tell you something," Willa said. Cecilia didn't answer, didn't leave. "I'm not your enemy," Willa said. "I know that's an odd thing to say tonight, but I mean it. You've just dismantled 2 years of legal work. I know. You've cost Roland Fitch a significant investment. I know that too. And you're telling me you're not my enemy. I'm telling you what's true." Willa turned to look at her. Cecilia kept facing the city, but she was listening. Willa could feel it. "You're not doing this because you dislike me. You're doing it because you're afraid. You're afraid Jasper is going to make a decision that costs him everything the way someone else's decision once cost you something. I don't know the details, but I recognize the shape of it." The city below was busy and lit and had no opinion on any of this. Cecilia's hands shifted on the railing, the smallest adjustment. "My brother," she said finally, very quietly. "Garrett." Willa waited. "He married a woman once, before Jasper's mother. A woman who had nearly ended the company, nearly ended him. He recovered." She stopped. Barely. I watched him almost not come back from it, and I have watched Jasper his whole life for the same blind spots, the same patterns. And you saw them in me, Willa said. I saw someone who came from nothing, with nothing, exactly the way she did. And a long silence. And perhaps, Cecilia said slowly, carefully, I have been looking so hard for the pattern that I couldn't see the difference. It was not an apology, but it was a door. The smallest crack of light under a door that had been closed for a very long time. Willa did not push it. She just acknowledged it was there. Jasper needs people who are honest with him, she said. Not people who manage him for his own good without telling him they're doing it. He has enough of that. She looked at the city lights. He could use an aunt who tells him the truth, if that's something she's willing to be. A very long silence. Then Cecilia turned. First time she'd looked directly at Willa, not assessing, not measuring, just looking. You are not what I expected, she said. No, Willa agreed. I don't imagine I am. Cecilia straightened. The red silk settled. She looked at the city once more and then went back inside. Not with the sharp, controlled exit she'd made from Aldrave House, just back inside, the door swinging behind her. Willa stayed at the railing. The cold came in off the mountains. Even here, even in the city, you could feel them at night. The cold rolling down from the high country was its own particular thing, and she recognized it now. It felt in this moment familiar. It felt like something she was beginning to belong to. Jasper came through the balcony door. He handed her a glass of something amber without asking whether she wanted it and stood beside her looking at the same city. Roland's gone, he said. I know. You read page 11? I read all the pages, the night I found the folder. When I gave you the will after dinner, I already knew what was in it. I just wanted my own copy to take to Denver. He was quiet a moment. Then very quietly he laughed. Low and genuine, surprised by itself, the laugh of something that came out before he could decide whether to permit it. You told me on the first day, he said, on the road up. You implied there were things to figure out. I said I'd figure them out. I generally mean what I say. I've noticed, he said. They stood in the cold together. The ballroom noise came through the glass behind them, muffled and warm. Willa, he said. She waited. I need to say something, and I need you to hear it as something I've worked out carefully, not something I'm saying because the moment calls for it. All right. He turned to face her. She turned to face him. 2 feet of cold Denver night between them. I planned things without your knowledge. Twice. I arranged what information you had so you'd make the choices I needed, and I told myself both times that I was doing it with good intentions. He held her gaze. Steady. Good intentions don't make it right. I was managing you, and you are not a person who should be managed. No person should be managed. She looked at him. I know what it cost you to walk into this, he said. Your family, your home, your life handed to a stranger on incomplete information I deliberately kept incomplete. I'm sorry. Not because things turned out badly, they didn't. Because you deserved the full truth from the beginning, and I decided my plan was more important than your right to it. That was wrong. It would have been wrong regardless of how any of this turned out. The cold moved between them. She breathed it in. This was the thing she'd needed. Not justification, not good intentions presented as sufficient. The truth held clearly without armor, without trying to make it smaller than it was. I know, she said. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud because some things need to be said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come to her door in the dark with a plan that was well-intentioned and wrong, and had led her here to this balcony, to this city, to a role she hadn't known she was capable of filling. From here, she said. That's what I told you the first night. We build from here, both of us knowing what we're building. Yes, he said. I mean it now the same as I meant it then. I know you do. Good. She turned back to the city. Then stop apologizing and figure out how we're getting a teacher to that school before January. I want someone in place before the worst of winter. He was quiet for a moment. Then that laugh again. Low, real, a little startled by itself. Yes, he said. All right. They rode back to Aldrave Valley 3 days later. The road climbed out of Denver into the foothills and then higher into the country that didn't apologize for itself. The pines came back in. The air changed thinner, sharper, honest in the way that mountain air is always honest. Willa watched the city disappear behind them and felt something in her chest unknot that she hadn't entirely known was knotted. The valley appeared when they came through the pass, same as always. Wide and hidden and green even in late November, the river bright down the middle, the mountains holding everything in their patient, cold arms. Aldrave House in the center of it, smoke from 3 chimneys, windows catching the afternoon. She looked at it, hers now. Not the way a prize is yours or a bargain's conclusion. The way a place is yours when it has learned not to expect you to be smaller than you are. Home, Jasper said quietly. Home, she agreed. The weeks after Denver moved differently. Something had settled, not softly, not the settling of no more tension, but the way a foundation settles when it's done shifting. A heaviness that becomes ground. The workers' cabins were repaired before the first hard freeze. Willa had made the list herself and told Jasper to give it to the foreman with authority to act on it, not to review it first. He did. By the end of November, the worst drafts were sealed. A teacher was found. A woman named Orpha Finch from Boulder, who had been teaching in a city school and wanted something different. She arrived in December with 2 trunks of books and immediate, unaffected interest in the 7 students waiting for her. The school had 8 by the end of her first week, then 11. Willa started a correspondence with the governor's office. Regular letters, specific observations. A creek crossing needing reinforcement before spring. A settlement 2 valleys east with no access to medical care. A family of 4 who had lost their cabin roof in an early storm. Small things, practical things, real things, which was the only kind of thing she had ever known how to do. She also began work on something larger. A proposal drafted in the evenings by the fire added to and revised over 2 weeks on timber management practices for the high country. Not theoretical. Grounded in what she had seen at Aldrave House and what she had heard from the mill workers and what she had understood about the relationship between the eastern creek slopes and the washed-out road and the families who used it. The proposal argued for a rotation system, for leaving stands intact on the steepest slopes above water sources, for replanting as a company obligation rather than an afterthought, for involving the workers who lived on the land in decisions about how it was cut. She showed it to Jasper on a Tuesday evening. He read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read the middle section again. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. "Can we implement it?" "Parts of it. The contract cycle with the Denver suppliers would need renegotiating." "Then renegotiate." He looked at her. "Some of them will walk," he said. "Then find suppliers who won't." She looked back at him steadily. "Your father built this company in 30 years. You have time to build it differently. The question is whether you want to." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "I do." She nodded, took the proposal back, made 3 more notes in the margin. They worked until the fire burned low. A letter came from Cecilia in early December. Single page, formal hand. Not warm, but no longer the temperature of a weapon either. She had spoken with Roland Fitch. The Eastern investors had been informed that the cutting rights proposal was withdrawn. There would be no further legal action concerning the will. At the bottom, in slightly different ink added after a pause, she hoped to visit in the spring if welcome. She had some of Garrett's papers Jasper might want. She had been thinking about what Willa had said on the balcony. She did not say what conclusions she'd reached. But she had been thinking. Willa set the letter on the table. She wrote back that spring was welcome. That was all. But it was enough. Some doors don't need to be thrown open immediately. They just need to be left unlocked so the person on the other side can decide when they're ready to come through. Christmas came to Aldrave Valley quiet and cold and full. Her father came up from Harrow Creek with Denny and Clara on December 22nd. Willa rode out to meet them on the road. Saw them before they saw her, the wagon coming through the lower pines, Walt sitting straight on the bench in his good coat, Clara's red scarf bright in the gray morning air, Denny's hat already at its characteristic angle, regardless of how it had been placed. She sat her horse at the edge of the road and watched them come. Walt saw her first. His face did the thing she'd been afraid to see in the cabin doorway that October morning when she hadn't looked back. But here on this road in this light with the valley behind her and the mountains above, she could see it without it breaking her. Proud. Underneath everything else, the cough and the shame and the years of not enough, he was proud of her. He had always been. He just hadn't always had a way to show it that didn't cost her something to receive. Now it cost her nothing. She rode toward them. Clara launched herself off the still-moving wagon in the way of 11-year-olds who have not yet learned to wait for things to fully stop. And Willa caught her and held her and breathed in the cold and the wool and the particular smell of her sister. "I found 23 beetles since you left," Clara said into her shoulder. "Tell me about every single one," Willa said, starting with the most interesting, starting with the first. Denny hung back with the dignified restraint of a 9-year-old who considered himself too old for launched hugs but was clearly fighting the impulse. Willa held out her arm and he came into it and held on briefly and then stepped back and put his hat right and looked around at the valley with the expression of someone making a professional assessment. "That's a big barn," he said. "It is," she agreed. Do they need any help with it? I'll put in a word." Walt was last. He climbed down from the wagon with the careful economy of a man managing diminished reserves and stood in the cold road looking at her. She went to him, held him carefully the way you hold something you love that has become fragile. His arms around her were thinner than she remembered, but still her father's arms. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He stepped back, looked at her properly. At her face, at the way she was standing, at whatever it was in a person's bearing that tells you something important about what has happened to them since you last saw them. "You did all right," he said, quietly, "just the two of them." "I did," she said. That afternoon Walt stood at the edge of Aldrave Valley and looked at it for a long time. Didn't say much, the cough had taken some of his wind, but stood with his hands in his pockets and his eyes still sharp, and looked at the river and the meadows and the house and the mountains above everything. "Well," he said finally, very quietly. "Well," she agreed. He put his arm around her. It was thinner than it used to be, but it was her father's arm, and she leaned into it the way she had leaned into it as a small child when the world was still something that happened to other people, and this arm was the border of everything safe. They stood together and looked at the valley. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything she had not known she was moving toward when she made a decision in the dark with a guttering candle and a family that needed her, and a thin, desperate hope that the man at her door had looked at her straight for a reason. That night after dinner, after Denny had been persuaded that the barn's nocturnal inhabitants did not require investigation, and Clara had fallen asleep upright in her chair, in the committed way of children fighting sleep and losing, and Walt had gone to the warmest guest room with his breathing slower. Up here she'd noticed the mountain air doing something the valley couldn't. After all of that, Willa stood on the front porch of Aldrave House. Alone. Just a moment, just long enough. The valley was completely still. The river made its patient, continuous sound. Stars out in full, the high-altitude kind that crowds the dark, more of them than seems reasonable, more than the sky can comfortably hold, pushing against each other in their abundance. She thought about every pair of eyes that had looked at her over the course of her 24 years. The trading post in Harrow Creek, the county fair, the Denver ballroom, Roland Fitch's carefully averted gaze, Cecilia's measuring one, the gray-haired man who had nodded from across the room. She thought about what all those eyes had seen when they decided they already knew the answer. A miner's daughter, overweight, unmarriageable, insufficient for rooms she needed to be in. And she thought about what was actually true. She had walked into every one of those rooms. She had not shrunk. She had not waited for permission to take up the space she occupied. She had just been herself completely without reduction and was still standing. The mountains were dark against the stars. Patient. Enormous. Completely unimpressed by anyone's opinion of them. They had been here long before any human assessment of worth, and they would be here long after, and they had their own idea about what mattered, and it had nothing to do with the size of a woman's dress, or the name of her family, or whether she knew which fork to use at a Denver dinner. She understood that. She had always understood it. She had just needed somewhere large enough for it to make sense. The door opened behind her. Jasper. She knew his footsteps the way she now knew the sound of this valley, the river, and the wind in the high pines, and the particular creak of the third stair, and the sound of Denny eating breakfast fast, and the sound of Clara talking to things that didn't answer, and the sound of her father's breathing slower here, easier in the mountain air. She knew the sounds of a life that was against considerable odds hers. He stood beside her. The right distance. He'd gotten good at that. They looked at the valley together. "The school needs more firewood before the end of the month," she said. "I want to talk to the foreman in the morning." "All right. And I have a letter to write to Hartwell's office about the Eastern settlement. I want to see it myself in spring before I advise on anything. I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know." He looked at her sideways. "I want to, if that's allowed." She considered. "It's allowed," she said. The cold had come in earnest now. The serious kind. The kind that means business and has no patience for sentiment or hesitation. She stood in it anyway. Because some things are worth the cold. Some things you breathe in and keep the clean, sharp truth of a high-altitude night, the particular weight of a life that is genuinely, actually yours. The love that doesn't find you because you performed the right things, or came from the right family, or fit the right idea of what a woman should look like. The love that finds you because you stepped in front of your sister without flinching, because you didn't look away first, because you got up every morning when the only reason to get up was that there was no other choice, and you did it enough times that it stopped being survival and started being character, and character turned out to be the only thing that mattered in any room you'd ever needed to be in. Willa Fenn Briggs Aldrave, 24 years old, from Harrow Creek, Colorado, standing on the porch of her own house, in her own valley, under her own stars, taking up exactly the space she took up. And it was enough. It was everything.